Okay, so hello and welcome to the first of our podcast for Impakter.com. For those of you who don't know, Impakter is a publication that works to support the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And this includes areas such as access to quality education, climate action, health and well-being, clean energy, etc. And today we are going to focus on the intersection between farming methods, particularly in the US, and human health. So to enlighten us on this topic, I am joined today by Dr. Stephanie Seneff, and I'm very excited about this. Dr. Seneff is a senior research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She received her bachelor's degree in biophysics and then her master's degree in electrical engineering, and then went on to pursue her PhD in electrical engineering and computer science. And more recently, she's been focusing her attention on nutrition research and has published numerous papers on a number of different health conditions, mainly seemingly chronic conditions and degenerative in nature. Recent years, she's really kind of turned her focus back toward biology. And I'm very excited to be introducing you all to her today. Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So you already know what we're going to focus on today.
My favorite topic.
Your favorite topic. And this is glyphosate.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are not familiar with glyphosate, it is the big bad active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup. And it's pretty much used ubiquitously across conventional farming. And so Stephanie, if you could maybe just give listeners a brief overview of what glyphosate is exactly, and maybe go into a brief history as well as to how it got its start. Interestingly, as a chelating agent, which I never would have guessed.
Right. Yes.
But yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes, it was originally patented as a chelating agent, and then they accidentally discovered that it killed plants, and they thought, oh, maybe this can be an herbicide. It's kind of an accidental discovery. That probably happens a lot. Mm. And then they actually Monsanto got the patent, and they started using it and making it available in 1974, I believe it was, but mid 1970s. And use of it ramped up slowly up until about 1997, 1998. That was when they introduced the GMO Roundup Ready crops. And so they had this really great breakthrough in genetic engineering, where they were able to insert a bacterial gene into certain crops, into the genome of the crop, so that the crop would not be sensitive to glyphosate. It would be able to live in the presence of glyphosate, because it kills all plants otherwise, except for those that are engineered to resist it. And because of that, it made a huge difference in the convenience of farming, because they could just spray the glyphosate all over the crop and the crop wouldn't die, instead of having to focus on the weeds and try to keep it away from the plant. Much, much harder. And they could crowd the crop, they could increase the yield. So they thought, this is great. And glyphosate, was studied by Monsanto, and they found some interesting things going on that they basically hid. And they managed to get the regulators to agree that this stuff is great, it's harmless to humans, practically harmless to humans. We love it. And so it became eventually the most common. Certainly the US is has the biggest usage of glyphosate worldwide. And glyphosate is by far the most used herbicide on the planet. Probably even the most used, pesticide in general, even when you take into account the insecticides and the fungicides and all of those. I think glyphosate is still probably number one, the most present in the environment. And it's all over the place. It's in the rain, it's in the tampons, it's in the clothing, it's in the sterile cotton gauze, it's all over the food supply. It's particularly high in surprising foods because they're not GMO. So people think if I buy non-GMO, I'm safe. But some of the non-GMO foods have been found to have the highest amounts, like Cheerios and Oreo cookies and goldfish crackers. I mean, these are things that kids love. And they have high values, and hummus, so any kind of chickpeas or garbanzo beans or lentils, these crops are all sprayed rather routinely, I think now, right before harvest as a desiccant. So the crops are not insensitive to glyphosate. They die, but that's what you want at the harvest time. you synchronize the harvest. The plant, in its last gasp, it goes to seed, so it increases the yield of the seeds, and it pushes the glyphosate right into the seed before it dies. So it ends up with really high levels. And that to me is very disturbing, because people think non-GMO, oh, that's good, that's safe, and it's not true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe if you could just, for listeners out there, explain a little bit about what the desiccation process is. You know, I know that it helps to speed up the ripening of certain crops, and it's particularly used on wheat.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to maybe go into that.
Well, yeah, that's a great topic, because I really believe that glyphosate usage on wheat is what's causing the epidemic we're seeing in gluten intolerance and celiac disease. We now have probably more than 1% of the population, certainly more than 1% that are gluten sensitive, and even celiac disease itself, which is the genetic profile, is probably 1% of the population. That's really high. That's like on the order of what's happening with autism.
Yeah.
And the wheat and the oats too, you know, and the garbanzo beans, all of these things. Also barley, which of course means beer, you know. And wine also is testing positive for glyphosate. They use it to control the wheat around the vines, and then it gets into the grapes. I mean, it's quite amazing, because the grapes are sensitive to glyphosate. So despite that, it's still getting into the wines, you know. So it's they in Canada, particularly like the winter wheat in Canada, they're often facing a frost, and so sometimes it's a desperate act to catch the crop before the snow comes, before the frost, because that could, you know, really ruin the crop. So you can appreciate why a farmer might really welcome glyphosate as an opportunity to save the crop in a situation like that.
Well,
so
absolutely. It's kind of a convenient fix, right?
Yes.
Instead of looking at things over the long term, it's a Band-Aid sort of for all these different issues that are popping up. And that's interesting that you bring up, you know, the glyphosate in the wheat, and then in wines. I know particularly California wines are very high in glyphosate. And I have friends who are so-called celiac or gluten intolerant in the United States, and then they go to Europe and they're completely fine. I was actually just talking with one of my friends the other day at my conference for work about wine, and he was saying that he's particularly sensitive to wines from California, but then some European wines, he's okay drinking those and doesn't get the same sort of, you know, side effects, so to speak. And I know there's also a lot of evidence that people are really sensitive to the sulfites in wine.
And that, of course, is also
affected by glyphosate.
Yes, that's very interesting.
So I guess let's kind of get down to the nitty gritty a little bit and get into exactly how glyphosate works in the body and in the environment. We can maybe talk a little bit about how it disrupts the sugarmate pathway, which Monsanto will argue, well, it's only found in plants, bacteria, fungi.
Right. Our cells don't have that pathway, so yay, we're good. You know?
Right, so we're fine. But no, we are not fine.
It's interesting, because we are learning that the bacteria are so important for our health. And we really, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't pay any attention to the bacteria. They were simply doing their job. Everything was fine. And we didn't realize all the things they were doing, because they were working fine. And now that they're being disrupted by glyphosate, you know, we're seeing all these issues with gut problems that people are having. And then we're realizing, we talk about gut dysbiosis and microbial imbalances, and we're seeing all of that. And we're realizing that there are these beneficial bacteria that are being killed off. And studies have shown that glyphosate preferentially kills lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. And those are two superheroes in our gut that are that flourish, you know, when the infant's born. The lactobacillus is what drinks the milk, basically. They can metabolize the milk very nicely. If they're being killed, then the milk doesn't get digested. And there's glyphosate in breast milk. I mean, Zen Honeycutt of Moms Across America tested several samples of breast milk from different nursing moms, and she found glyphosate in something like 30%. And the highest was 1,600 times as high as what's allowed in the water in Europe. So that's pretty disturbing, that you're feeding your child glyphosate in your breast milk. Now, of course, if you switch to soy formula, you're probably doing even worse. And so the lactobacillus, you know, they are important for digesting wheat. And so I think part of the issue with the wheat is that the lactobacillus have several different enzymes that specialize in breaking down gluten, because gluten is an interesting protein with a lot of proline, and proline is a difficult amino acid to digest.
Mm-hmm.
So these bacteria have developed all these specialized genes, specialized enzymes that are skilled at breaking down gluten, but those bacteria are being affected, and so they can't, and so then the gluten doesn't get properly digested, and then you get these gluten peptides that cause autoimmune disease. So that's one pathway. And of course, the shikimate pathway. So these bacteria have the shikimate pathway, and glyphosate kills them because it's essential to them. The shikimate pathway is essential to them.
Mm-hmm.
And they use that pathway to produce the 3 aromatic amino acids, which are essential amino acids because our cells can't make them. And obviously we can't make them because we don't have that pathway. It's very clear. So we become deficient if our microbes can't produce those for us. And those aromatic amino, first of all, they go into all the proteins of the body. And the proteins are the workhorses that do all the work. You know, the enzymes and the transmitters, all these things are proteins, and these structural proteins. They all need aromatic amino acids. And furthermore, the aromatic amino acids are precursors to all of the neurotransmitters, serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, melanin, the skin tanning agent, thyroid hormone, folate, the B vitamin, and NAD, which is a really important antioxidant. So all these things are going to be deficient if our bacteria aren't able to make those aromatic amino acids.
With fertility as well.
Yes.
I've read a few articles on that where, a lot of livestock are being fed GMO, heavily glyphosated feed, right? And first of all, a lot of the feed is not necessarily foods that they're naturally supposed to be eating.
Right. That's one problem.
So that's issue number one. But yeah, issue number two, it's really interesting because they go from this glyphosated feed and seeing gastrointestinal problems, as in pigs and cows is what they were looking at, and miscarriages, stillborns, as well as deformities,
Yeah.
And then switching over, and this was actually in a documentary that I watched, was switching over to organic feed solved those problems, and fertility rates actually doubled within 18 months.
That is so amazing, isn't it? Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
Eve Peterson has a huge pig farm in Denmark, and he shows pictures on the web of these deformed piglets, and they wrote a paper when they detected high levels of glyphosate in the tissues of these deformed piglets, which was really, really sad.
Yeah. And you
causing deformities,
that would be a red flag.
I know.
If it's doing this to animals, wouldn't it be doing the same thing to humans? And we are seeing a lot of issues, fertility issues, you know, in the United States.
I know. We have a huge problem and growing fast with infertility. And it's because it's accumulating. I think that the problems are growing faster than the exposure is growing because we're accumulating it over our lifespan in our tissues.
Right.
So it builds up.
It's not secreted.
It's not all of it. I mean, most of it goes out, but there's enough that stays behind that it'll accumulate. And then as you get older, you accumulate more, and it goes into the bone marrow, and it comes out on the backs of the immune cells when they're going to fight an infection or heal a wound. They carry the glyphosate to the site of the wound, and then the wound doesn't heal. That's what I think is going on. I mean, it's really, we're having a lot of issues with poor wound healing and of course, the deficient immune system because the immune cells are laden with glyphosate. They can't work properly. They have a sulfate problem as well, and sulfate is essential for them to be able to, even to clear cellular debris or to clear a dead cell. They need sulfate to do that. Mm-hmm. And they're deficient as well. So I think that the sulfate deficiency has huge ramifications.
Right. And if you want to maybe go, once again, a little further in depth on that, because you talk a lot about the cholesterol sulfate.
Yes.
And it's this common misconception that having high cholesterol, is caused by eating high cholesterol foods.
Right. That's so
And so everybody's trying to avoid cholesterol in their diet, and that's actually detrimental to
making the cholesterol go up.
Health. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to
understand that. That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Quite striking. Eat cholesterol.
Well, people believe what they here, right?
Yeah, I
And
know.
important to get the word out about this sort
Yeah.
of thing.
And a low fat diet, I think, is a terrible diet. I mean, I think fat is really one of the
Yeah,
healthiest food sources, and people should be eating really healthy fat too, of course, organic,
absolutely. It's
grass-fed beef.
absolutely essential for brain function.
Absolutely. And it's so
Um,
sad. All these people are trying to be health conscious and have been eating a low fat diet for years, and now they're very sick. It's just so
yeah,
sad.
low fat and whole
Exactly.
wheat, right?
Yes, exactly. And of
Yeah.
course, wheat germ is really a healthy wheat germ, has a lot of nutritional value, but it's got tons of glyphosate. Glyphosate goes into the germ and it ends up with even more.
I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Stephen Gundry, and he proposes, that a lot of gut issues, at
Mhm.
least, and as we know, gut issues are tied to so many other issues, chronic inflammation throughout the body, and he ties a lot of these issues with eating lectins in the diet.
Mm.
And one of the foods that is supposedly high in lectins is legumes, right?
Mm-hmm. There you
So
go.
I'm wondering,
Eating legumes. I
because
know.
legumes are very highly glyphosated. They're one of
Yes.
those crops that are commodity crops, I suppose, and sprayed pretty
Yeah.
soon before harvest.
Right.
So I'm wondering if maybe there's an overlap.
I think people are making huge mistakes in analyzing what's going on because they're overlooking the glyphosate. They're trying to figure out what's causing the problem with this food, and
Mm,
they're overlooking the thing that's really causing the problem, which is the glyphosate. So they're looking for something else. Tony Mitra. Tony Mitra is a Canadian activist who harassed his government for many years and finally got them to test a whole bunch of foods for glyphosate. So Canada actually stands out. First of all, Canada and the US use the most in the world,
mm.
and Canada can be praised for having done the most measuring of glyphosate in foods. And so they produced measures for over 8,000 different food samples, and they gave all the data to Tony. And Tony published a book called Poison Foods of North America, where he analyzed, he gave people all
Chipper.
this data. Yeah, a nice title. But that's where he saw the legumes, I think, were coming out on top. Like they had more glyphosate than anything else.
Wow, more than the wheat, the soy, the
Yeah,
corn.
more than all of those. It was
Wow.
really amazing. And
I knew it
specifically,
was up there. I didn't realize that it was at the top. That's
yeah,
really
very, very high
interesting.
levels in both US and Canada. And again, much, much lower because Canada imported foods from Europe and from Mexico. Those foods were on the average much, much lower. So it was a consistent pattern that Canada and the US came up on top with the highest levels by far. And sometimes the organics from Europe came up. The non-organics from Europe came up with lower levels than the organics from America, which is very discouraging because the organics are not necessarily glyphosate free. They're much lower usually, which is
Mhm.
good. You can certainly reduce your glyphosate burden by eating certified organic, and we certainly do that in our household. I really recommend that. That's a simple step you can take. Eat certified organic, and you will reduce your glyphosate burden.
I tell all my friends to do.
Yeah,
You
and we
don't
can
realize
change
how
the world.
important.
Not just for you, right? But if enough people do it, then the farmers will stop growing. I mean, if we won't buy their food, they'll stop
Exactly.
growing it. That's the thing. The consumer has a lot of power, and we need to realize that. And we need to tell our friends and get them all on board with buying organic. And you will save money on the diseases that you don't get because of eating organic. It makes so much sense.
Oh, yeah. Where you
Yeah.
spend your money drives the economy. It's funny because I kind of want to shift into the effect that glyphosate has on the soil as well
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm. Yeah.
the
Same
environment.
thing.
And it's interesting because I just see these parallels between antibiotic usage in humans and essentially an antibiotic for the soil,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we're treating these issues in the same way,
And
where
both are wrong, right?
right, where we're just putting a
Yeah.
band-aid on the problem, a quick fix, and now we're seeing an an abundance of super weeds that are starting
Yeah.
to proliferate, and we're also starting to see super bugs that are resistant to antibiotics in humans, and there's just this parallel between
Yes.
the two, and we're
Yes.
so wrong in the way that we're going about this. I'd like to talk a little bit more about how glyphosate is affecting the soil, traditional farming practices versus organic farming, and nitrogen fixation in the soil and all of that
Yeah.
helps to feed a healthy ecosystem.
Right. And of course, it's key to have a lot of organic matter in the soil. And in fact, treating the soil, it's really interesting to look at what's been successful, which is really the same thing that's using to treat the humans. Things like probiotics, prebiotics, minerals, these are all the things that we can take to help improve our gut microbiome. But you can also use those in the soil. And then organic matter from the soil is one of the best things you can take orally to help remove glyphosate. And organic matter is what the soil needs to also be able to fight glyphosate. But glyphosate's killing off the organic matter. So the soil is becoming very, very poor quality. It doesn't hold water. The organic matter is what allows it to hold water. So when you have a rainstorm and the soil just washes off, it can't soak it up like a sponge anymore because there's no organic matter, and then of course it's the wrong microbes in the soil. So the microbes that actually promote nitrogen uptake by the plants get disrupted by glyphosate. So nitrogen fixation becomes impaired, and then you have to use more nitrogen fertilizer. And then you end up with the nitrogen washing off and causing these growth of all these cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae that are causing such a problem in the Great Lakes and also in Florida waterways. I think glyphosate's a major player in those problems that we're seeing with the blue-green algae. Of course, the climate change, the heat, once you have warm weather, promotes the growth as well. So the combination of the heat on top of the washing off of all these nitrate fertilizers that didn't get taken up by the plants because the microbes weren't able to properly assist them in the uptake of the nitrogen fertilizers. So, and of course the minerals also, the same problem. The microbes help the plants to take up minerals, and that gets messed up too. So the plants end up depleted in minerals because they're not able to get it up, because glyphosate is chelating the minerals and making them unavailable. Glyphosate is a very good mineral chelator. So we end up with deficiencies in, manganese and zinc and cobalt, all of these important micronutrients that we're not getting enough of them in our food because our food's not getting enough of them. And of course, our food is also not healthy itself because of that.
Yeah. And then also you talked about some of the runoff of the water, yes, because it's not being absorbed as well into the soil. I know that glyphosate also affects earthworms, and earthworms,
that's right,
of course, cause the aeration of the soil. So water absorbs very well into healthy soil, but runs off with the hard kind of compact glyphosated soil.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've done any research on this, but it seems everything comes back to glyphosate, but I'm wondering if there are other chemicals. There are man-made fertilizers that are utilized. I know there are a number of other chemicals that are used with conventional farming. And I was reading some papers by Dr. Seralini, and he had talked about the POE15, which is a chemical that's another chemical in Roundup that he believes is actually the most toxic.
I know, he and I disagree on that, although I think he's right that those are also toxic, and those are acutely toxic, those chemicals that they're adding to make the Roundup formulation. And they also make the glyphosate go up more easily into the plants and also into us. So, they're making the glyphosate more effective by allowing it to get in, and they themselves are inherently very toxic, acutely toxic. Glyphosate's more subtle. It takes a little more time for it to kill. But these, you really stun the plant with these other chemicals that are not being even tested. They're not even being studied. The government is just like, oh yeah, that's fine. They declare glyphosate's the toxic ingredient, and then they don't have to prove anything about the other things. And also, they only studied glyphosate in isolation. So he's making a lot of good points there. That when Monsanto researched glyphosate, they used pure glyphosate, but then when they actually apply it, they have all this other stuff in there that's making everything much more toxic. That's not part of what they've studied. So that is completely unfair, to just study glyphosate in isolation. And also glyphosate works synergistically with other chemicals, all the other insecticides and, any other chemicals that are in your environment. Glyphosate disrupts the liver's ability to detoxify a lot of these organic, these chemicals that are like organophosphates and things like that. Phenolic compounds, even chemicals that are produced by the pathogens in the gut that are toxins produced by the pathogens that normally you would be able to detoxify with the liver, but glyphosate's messing up the liver's ability to detoxify other things. So this makes everything else more toxic than it would otherwise be, because glyphosate's weakening the liver. And then
Yeah,
it can't
it's
hold
fascinating,
water.
but also really sad. That
Terrifying,
this
absolutely
is
terrifying.
what's happening, and it's so hard to avoid. You can change your lifestyle quite a bit to try
Yeah.
and eat cleaner, live in a cleaner environment, but we've done this to ourselves, we've done this to our environment, to our health. It's a tricky dilemma that we're dealing with.
I know.
But
you reach a point when you realize all of this, you reach a point where, oh my God, I want to get on a different planet. It's like,
yeah,
I can't be here. Where is there another planet I can move to?
I was talking to my mom, and I'm like, I'm just gonna move somewhere really remote. I'm gonna leave the country.
I know. I've been looking at Bhutan. My husband jokes with me about Bhutan.
Yes, the only
Bhutan
country in the world, right?
He says you wouldn't like it. There wouldn't be any internet. So,
that would be an issue.
I
know. That would be interesting. I don't know if you've done any studies on just the people of Bhutan or their.
I know. Yeah.
To see.
I haven't. I should really.
Chronic disease.
It would be so interesting to find out what their rate of autism is, because I bet you it's very, very low.
Oh, it's probably very low.
That would be very stunning, but which it's hard to get this kind of data for different countries. And of course, you always don't know how they're measuring it. Some countries measure it differently, so they're seeing more or seeing less. It's really difficult to compare different countries. I certainly can say U.S. has a very high rate of autism compared to most countries. And Korea might be even higher. South Korea, even higher than the U.S.
Well, that makes sense. South Korea is very similar in a lot of ways.
I know, and they have a huge, electronic exposure there too. So I wonder about the EMFs as well, but that's another topic.
That is a whole nother thing to go into. But that is really interesting, and that's only going to be increasing. You can see here I have my EMF eliminating headphones.
Very good.
I don't do any of those, Apple or the AirPods. Everybody's going around with AirPods, and I know all the time for having wires attached to my headphones. Like, well, I'm just trying to.
Me too.
Right? I was doing a little bit of thinking and just about how the everyday person can go about avoiding these toxins and living the healthiest possible life. And I know that you're talking about the mom with, I believe it's called Moms Across America.
Yes, I love her. She's really great. She's really worked hard to promote the concept of eating organic and bringing awareness to the public about glyphosate. She's really done a great job.
Right. And her child had autism, correct?
Yeah.
And then they were able to reverse it by going fully organic, living as clean a lifestyle as possible. And I'm really fascinated by the concept of vertical farming. And I don't know if you've looked into vertical farming methods in detail, but it's supposedly a way that we can grow plants indoors, grow it on top of each other, so you don't have to deal with the issue of not enough space. Obviously, deforestation is a huge issue when it comes to growing crops, and you can grow them in an urban environment, so then it would be closer to where the majority of people are living, and we're not being wasteful and driving food, across the country or flying it to other countries. And it's in a controlled environment, so you don't have to worry about different weather patterns. And then interestingly, a lot of crops can be grown without soil, which is where I'm a little iffy. I don't know if Dr. Zach Bush would be down for that.
You're right.
But yeah, I was wondering what your thoughts are on vertical farming, and is it a potential solution to this problem?
I guess they must be using light that is, electricity, right, for the light.
They do, and that's another concern is
it's going to consume power, and then
they're consuming energy. But then there are sustainable methods and solar.
They can use solar. I think solar is exciting, and I really hope that can really take off in the next couple decades.
Absolutely,
to help with the electricity problem and the consumption of fuels, which is fueling global warming. And the soil thing, I really can't imagine that a plant could be healthy if it's not growing in soil. I think there will have to be a lot of research to make sure that they've got it right. I think it's going to be tricky, I would guess. without soil.
Yeah.
I think soil is basic, so I'd be surprised, but it's probably worth trying, because like you say, huge advantages. And you can control weeds by just not letting them in, right? You have no seeds for them.
Exactly.
So
You have 100%
you have a
control over it. But then I get a little bit worried with that word control, because it seems like the more that we try and control our ecosystem, we try and control our bodies, we are actually doing harm, because there's so much that we don't know. And here we are, kind of like trying to play God.
Yeah, it has a lot of parallels with the
without soil. But it is really fascinating to me, and supposedly you can produce these crops in a way that they're very nutrient dense.
That's interesting. Yeah, you just basically
that's
feed in all the minerals.
You just feed everything that they need.
Yeah.
And you look at the root structure, it looks completely healthy.
Yeah.
So
That's very interesting.
That would be
it's worth trying.
Interesting way to go. And obviously we do have organic farming methods, no-till methods, and there's hope there, but making that economically viable at scale. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Another thing about the city is
feed the world in that way.
You could do rooftop farming, rooftop gardens, which is an interesting idea too for the urban farms. I like that concept as well, just to take advantage, because the rooftop is being wasted, It's up, it's got the sun, and just put some soil up there and
and it's hot too.
Yeah,
the more plants you have, the more oxygen you have, the less concrete to reflect the sun. So
I think that would be cool if the cities all had gardens growing on top of the buildings. I think that would be really neat, and I think that's a good idea too. Easier probably than the other one in terms of the technology of the development of it. And the other things, people keep talking about vegan diet, which I don't like. I think humans need
I was just going to bring that up with you.
I think we need animal, and also the plants need the animals. And I think it's really interesting to look at grass-fed beef. We put the cows in the CAFOs, these confined animal feeding operations, and we feed them this toxic food, and they produce this toxic waste, and then we have this problem with getting rid of the waste from that's causing a lot of these algae blooms and whatnot. It was just a total mess. Whereas the manure is actually really useful if the cow is just out on the grass. It helps to nourish the grass. It's a whole cycle. And the cow actually eating the grass stimulates its growth. So the grass, actually, you increase the grass yields by virtue of the cow eating it. And we can't eat the grass because we can't digest it. So you're turning something we can't eat into something we can eat that's very nutritious, with grass.
But then you have the release of methane gas.
But you don't. That problem is really more a problem with the CAFO cows, because they're so sick with the way they're eating. They're producing a lot of methane.
Interesting. I've heard differently on that one. I've heard, that cows can actually, when eating organic, can actually produce more methane gas.
Okay, that's something we'll have to do more research.
Who knows? There's so much information out there.
Yeah, you have to watch out where your source is, and we don't know who's right.
Yeah, and there's so much that everyone has to learn. This is really a huge emerging field, and it's so fascinating. And you're obviously doing incredible work in this area. I know that you do consume some animal products. I know that you really like eggs. And that we can easily become very deficient by not incorporating these foods into our diets. And I'm wondering, from an environmental perspective, what do you recommend for us to be able to consume those products but not have a detrimental effect on the environment, and do it in the most sustainable way possible?
Yeah, certainly we don't need to eat a lot of meat. I think still a lot of vegetables and fruits, and then some meat. I don't think we need to eat lots and lots of it. And I think eggs maybe are more sustainable than some other things. You probably know better than I do, but chicken eggs is probably a pretty good food from the standpoint of its value, its nutritional value. I think humans were designed to eat meat, and so when you don't eat meat, you end up with serious nutritional deficiencies. I think certainly cobalamin is a problem. Now I know people can take cobalamin as a supplement, and maybe they can do just fine. So and I know that many people in India have maintained a vegetarian diet for many, many years, for centuries going back in India. So it's not like we can't, it's possible. And maybe if you, we're eating organic and nutritiously grown foods that were all vegetable, you'd be fine. I mean, personally speaking, I like meat, so that's part of the issue, right? I don't like it.
Give it up.
Yeah, I don't really want to not eat meat, and so maybe that's a bias. But I do think that the animal-based foods have a lot of nutritional value that's hard to get from plants. Not impossible, probably, but hard.
Yeah, there are supplements out there. It's really interesting, but then who knows what's going into our supplements, and there could
I know they're always tricky.
But yeah, it's kind of a tricky topic, because I've experimented, with my own diet, and I've been vegan for about 10 months or so at this point. And I had tried it before in the past, and I'm doing it for environmental reasons. And I do find that it can be difficult to get a lot of the nutrients that your body needs. And people have this misconception that, it's B12 is what a lot of vegans are deficient in, which is true. You do need to take a solid B complex, but there are things like taurine. So your liver is supposed to make about 80% of the cholesterol that your body needs. And obviously with all the toxins that we're putting into our bodies, you talked about that earlier, it disrupts liver function.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things to consider. And then even just the essential amino acids tend to be a lot lower in plants than they would in
sulfur containing amino acids in particular. Sulfur containing.
Yeah. So, but definitely a solution would be to just cut back on meat consumption. I mean, the amount of meat that we consume in the United States is absolutely ridiculous.
I agree. You don't need a lot. You absolutely, yeah. I don't eat much meat. We always have we do a stir-fry Chinese food mostly. So it's a lot of veggies, and then you just put a little meat in. So we don't eat like a huge hunk of, steak.
Yeah, that's kind of the Michael Pollan way, right?
Yeah.
Lots of veggies, a little bit of meat on the side. So
yeah.
But we're seeing a shift. That's why I think nutritional research is kind of the future of medicine, so to speak, where
I agree.
There are people like you out there who are just doing this amazing work and really figuring out, okay, we have XYZ symptom, right? And why is this happening? Instead of, here, let's throw a drug at it.
Right. It was great talking with you. Bye-bye.
Want more stories like the one you just saw? Make sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell. We post new stories every day.